Let me welcome back to our show Brittany Lewis, who's a PhD candidate. It's always good to have you. And we're also joined by Kat Murti. She is the executive director of Feminists for Liberty, who's joining us for the first time. When you were invited to come on the show, I know people Google and do research about who they're going to be talking to. Did you have any hesitation about coming on?
I did not. Yeah. Should I have?
No, I'm just asking the question. You know, when you come on a set, so many people are defined by labels, and you say that you're director of the Feminists for Liberty. I just really want you to explain to our audience what that means. But before you even explain that to us, talk about growing up, what shaped you, shaped your ideology, your philosophy, the things that impacted you, had a profound impact that leads you to where you are today.
Sure. So as the organization name kind of alludes to, I am both a libertarian and a feminist. Growing up, I'm an Indian American woman. I grew up largely between North Texas and South India, spent some fair amount of time between the two, and I think that that's a big part of what shaped me. I also spent a lot of time in California, some time in New York and DC. So I guess to some extent, I've had the opportunity to be a part of many different worlds growing up. And what I got from that is that fundamentally people are individuals and they should be treated as such.
What about your parents? What did your parents do for a living?
Well, my dad worked in finance for a while, and my mother was a journalist and then an artist.
Mm-hmm. What books influenced you when you were growing up?
Oh, man, that's a long list. It's a long list. I don't even know where to begin. Honestly, a lot of dystopian fiction and dystopian fiction. Oh. Yeah, I like to see what the world could be if we are not if we aren't mindful about building a better world. But yeah, also a lot of political theory across the spectrum. I was very interested growing up in finding something that really spoke to me. And it wasn't actually until I was about 15, I was online having a debate in a political forum, and someone reached out to me and said, "Hey, I think you're a libertarian." I said, "What is that?" They sent me a quiz, which I would think normally wouldn't work, but for me it did. I looked through it and I was like, oh, it does say I'm a libertarian. Googled that and realized that for the first time I was finding people who actually did agree with me, which was a new experience for me.
So I like something you said. You said you realize that people are individuals.
Yes.
Not groups. People responsible and accountable for themselves. So for anyone who says to me that we are individuals, it tells me you're open to all ideas.
I try to
all
be.
Perspectives, and you're willing to listen.
Yes. I do think that there's some limit to that, obviously. I think that ideologies that are violent towards other people or...
violent? How is an ideology violent?
People who aggress against other people, people who try to force other people to do something, to shut them down, that's concerning. But fundamentally, I believe that most people... almost all people really want a better world. They just have different ideas of how to get there. And having that conversation, seeing where they're coming from and what their goals are, yeah, I do try to approach that with an open mind and have an idea about, you know, where we're going and how we can get there together.
You know, people hear the term feminism, me included, and we either shut it down, don't want to listen, and sometimes we don't even know what it is. I don't know if I've really, in a long time, asked someone to explain to us and our viewers, what is feminism today?
That's actually a big part of the reason why we started Feminists for Liberty. We are very concerned that people don't really seem to understand either feminism or libertarianism. So I would say that a feminist is someone who believes in the equality of the sexes. One way that people put it is libertarian feminist. If a feminist is someone who believes women are people, a libertarian feminist is someone who believes that people are individuals and should be treated as such, right? So as a libertarian feminist, I believe that it's not just social, political equality that matters, but it's also economic equality. and an equality of opportunity for people regardless of their sex or gender.
But what about men when they hear the term feminist and they feel that you're not for men, you're not for family, and this is something that sort of could be very disruptive to not only to my family, to me as a man?
I understand where that's coming from. I think it's a pretty natural reaction. The word feminism comes from a historical root. I don't think it makes sense to rebrand something that has existed for a very long period of time. But fundamentally, feminists care about things that negatively impact men as well. And it's certainly not just about women. The reason that that word comes about is because it comes from the women's rights movement and the long historic injustice towards women, where essentially through government women were prevented from doing a vast array of things, as they continue to be in many places around the world today. But there are many ways in which men are discriminated against or forced into roles that they otherwise would not choose for themselves. And that, I think, is also the purview of feminists.
Thank you. You know, you're on the show.
Yes.
Obviously, we get a lot of feedback. You're a curiosity because you don't really, you seem to be, you form your own ideas, you come to your own opinions, and it's not as if you really ingratiate yourself with either parties. I've gone back and watched some of your interviews before today, and it seems as though that you can see the challenge in both. So one of the things that we were very interested in with you is what it was that impacted you early on in life, where you've taken such a strong position on the issue of race and anthropology, and how it impacts people's lives and the role that the government plays in the issues of corporate America. And, you know, I've never really asked you that question before, but our audience really wants to know.
Yeah, so what's interesting is my political ideology has shifted over time, and that's why I always tried. I don't really believe in cancel culture, because I believe that we should allow people to grow, and what someone once may not have known, they should have the opportunity to read, to engage in a new experience, and to come to a new idea, because that's been my personal narrative. So I actually grew up in a household where my father, you know, was conservative, very much so. He's from the South, you know, very much so into the narrative of meritocracy, lifting himself up by the bootstraps. Didn't come from much, you know, financially growing up, but he said, I'm going to move my child into a specific community where I know she's going to get the best possible education. Ironically, I don't think, you know, he jokes and he says, I didn't know I was going to raise a little Angela Davis. I was pushed. You know, I think much to his, you know.
You grew up in Berkeley?
No, I didn't grow up in Berkeley. I grew up in a small, actually rather conservative, upper middle class, predominantly white community. And, you know, I think while my father had the best intentions as a form of survival, as a form of wanting me to be the best that I could possibly be, and he knew that living in a particular community would afford me certain opportunities that may not have been afforded somewhere else. And for that, I am thankful to my parents. However, it was with these microaggressions from being, you know, as they call the raisin in the rice bowl, or being, you know, the other in a group of people that didn't look like me, right? When I go swimming with the girls that don't look like me, because all my friends are white girls, you know, my hair grows up into an afro instead of down my back, and I'm being made fun of, right? And you know, things like being told, even though I'm an AP student, I'm in all the honor roll classes, and having my history teacher tell me that I have a better chance of getting into college than anyone in the room, and I'm like, well, I do, but that's solely because I'm one of the best in the room. And then, you know, I think it was those microaggressions and not having the language to defend myself, knowing that this doesn't make me feel comfortable, knowing that these things are harmful to me, and not having the language. So I initially actually went into Temple University as an engineering major because my parents had pushed math and science. However, Temple has a diversity and inclusion requirement, so you have to take a certain amount of courses around race and diversity. So in a lot of ways, going into undergraduate school was the beginning of this kind of evolution of my political ideologies, because once I started to take African American studies, well, first I took a sociology class, and I saw, statistically speaking, that groups that I identified with, whether that was women, African Americans, were at the bottom statistically of education, mass incarceration, healthcare, and I said, well, I identify with these groups, and I am none of these things, and I don't believe that just because I am black that I am born pathological, I'm born to be a criminal or less intelligent. So I then began to ask the question, what is the narrative behind those statistics? politics, because I don't believe we are just born less than. And it's in that I began to study African American studies, which began to paint the narrative, right? So much of what is happening today, both politically and a lot through the media, is not contextualized historically, right? So once you start looking at kind of this legacy of how we get to where we are today, you recognize that there is nothing wrong with us as women, as Black people, as minorities. There's actually a disconnect between the American public and the type of education that we are giving our students in the secondary school systems. Because even if you go into college, you can be a very brilliant lawyer or doctor in your profession, but that doesn't mean that you have a specific background or you know the history of individual marginalized communities.
And on that, you know what? It's so important to have conversations to get to know each other. That's where everything starts. You'll be shocked at what you learn and what you have in common. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we'll be back. You know, I was so pleasantly surprised because when normally people talk about their early influences, and when it comes to parents, the mother is always the first thing that they mention. And you notice, Kat, she mentioned her father. And did you notice during the break, she talked about her father around the dinner table. And even though her father talked about meritocracy, he's conservative, you've learned early on that you can have differences of opinions, not come to the same conclusions, but yet respectful, civil, and still love the person because you learned that from your father. And I never would have guessed that.
You know, I think what's really important is, even though I don't agree with my father, I do understand how he came to that particular ideology. I understand his lived experiences. I understand why he feels the way that he does. I mean, granted, that doesn't stop our dinner table arguments, and of course, I try and get him to see things from my perspective. However, I do understand how he arrived to that place.
But it also prepared you for the world we're in today, where, and you know, so I want to make this statement. So I want you to react to it because my spirit is leading me differently today. Instead of talking about news of the day, I think this is far more important. I think this is the thing that has made our show so successful for so many decades, because it's so unscripted. And I feel the guests, and if they take me somewhere, that's where I'm going. I abandon whatever I thought I would do. So, you know, help me with this. I'm going to tell you some of the things I think, and I want to tell me how flawed it is or how naive I am. So I have this book out. My new book is out. What Black and White America Must Do Now. I say to people, you know, it doesn't matter that George Floyd was black, or that the police officer was white. I think what matters is that any time a human being's life is taken in such a brutal and vile way, all humanity should cry out and be outraged and demand justice and demand that these rogue law enforcement officers are brought to justice. And to remind Americans, it may have been George Floyd last week, Breonna Taylor last month, but it's just a matter of time before it happens to you, because your skin doesn't protect you, no matter what you may think about privilege. And until we get to the point where we're outraged of the fact that it diminishes humanity, not everyone feels that they're part of it, because you say, well, I'm going to feel stronger about it because it's black. I'm going to feel less about it because it's white-on-white crime. I'm going to feel even less about it if it's black-on-black crime. When did we get to the point where we're outraged that we have these rogue cops who are taking people's lives for no reason at all? And look at Minneapolis, Kat. Look at Minneapolis. Minneapolis has the most progressive laws on the book against police brutality from experience from past protesters who are in positions of leadership now. And even with all that, it still happens. And so also, 90% of law enforcement officers de-escalate the situation. It doesn't lead to violence. It doesn't lead to harm. They don't fire their weapons. And so in the end, it's the individual. You have to condemn that officer because he's not necessarily representative of the entire police force, because in the end, you can pass all the laws in the book, but an individual has to be held accountable and responsible.
Well, the individual has to be held accountable, and that's the problem. They're not being held accountable, right? You can say that 90% of officers maybe are de-escalating, but what happens when those officers don't de-escalate? What happens? Why do we have situations where the same officers are getting complaints and complaints and complaints, right? Look at the officer, for instance, who killed George Floyd. He had a giant file of complaints against him,
and he'd still pass them on to the
next,
next,
right?
Right.
So, I mean, at that point, we're not really treating them as individuals. They're being protected by this system that they're in, by that thin blue line, right? And I do think to some extent that these things get turned into a culture war where it turns into a left versus right issue or a black versus white issue. And yes, at the core, anybody can be hurted by these government forces at any point. These are major problems in the system. I do think that there is at least some degree to which who you are makes you more or less likely to be targeted for a variety of reasons, including some of the ones Brittany talked about. But yeah, I mean, if we're treating this as solely a race issue and not an issue with policing and an issue with the laws that are protecting dangerous policemen and the culture that protects dangerous policemen, yes, I mean, look at this. This country has been protesting. We've been having protests around the country for over 100 days right now. And, you know, corporate America, they're responding a little bit. They're giving us all of these sort of like woke capitalism moments, which is fine, it's a step, but it's not getting to the core of the problem. The core of the problem is we need to do things like abolish qualified immunity. We need to do things like hold police officers accountable. And this has nothing to do with what race they are or what party they vote for. It has to do with the system and the fact that the system is flawed.
You know, the other thing I learned, because I want to be more open, I want to learn more, because we need, and I don't think the politicians can take us where we need to go.
No.
I think the answer lies here. You know, I read in the Washington Post recently, they did a study on who is necessarily victims of violence and death by law enforcement officers. I was shocked at the number of women who've died at the hands of law enforcement. It's never mentioned. You would think it's only black men, but it's not.
And it's not even when they're on the clock. You have to look at just the high percentage of domestic violence and domestic abuse cases by officers against their partners.
Absolutely. I think this is it's such an important point that you bring up.
Let me have you hold that point. Because we were having a real discussion here today. I mean, we get caught up in what Biden is doing and what Trump is doing, but what really matters is what we're going to do to change this country. But we want to talk about that, about women. I'm Armstrong Williams. We're going to take a break. Kat, and I and my girl here coming back, I forgot your name there, Brittany. Okay, I had to be honest about it. You know, it slips. I'm human. It slips. Brittany, thank you. We'll be back. Don't go away. And welcome back. I'm Armstrong Williams, and we're having a real substantive civil conversation about real progress here, about what we can do to make this country of ours that we love a better place for everybody. And Brittany was about to talk about the issue that I raised of the article I read in the Post about women and the violence and the death, and Kat chimed in about the domestic violence and law enforcement officers who take a lot of their anger home and are mad. Go ahead.
Absolutely. I thought the point that you brought up earlier was excellent when we talk about this kind of invisible reality of the dangers that women face with their relations with various police departments and policing. I think this is why the Say Her Name movement began, is because we can so quickly recall the George Floyds, the Tamir Rices, the Trayvon Martins, but can we name all of the women that have been victims of police brutality? Even when I think of the most recent incidents, right, we largely hear the names George Floyd, but what is going on with Breonna Taylor? I know a lot of the conversation is often, well, if they don't resist, if they just follow the law, well, what do you do when you're someone who's asleep in your bed? What if you do when you're actually on the front lines every day, you know, helping Americans, you know, with COVID-19 as a first responder, and you still lose your life as a woman, and there's still no justice here. So I think it's extremely important that we talk about these issues. And then in terms of domestic violence, you know, it's very difficult when you're dating a police officer. I actually have a friend out of Delaware where she is a police officer. Her partner was a police officer, and he was abusing her and he was beating her, and she could not get protection. At the end of the day, they were siding with her partner, who was the abuser, who was the aggressor, and he was a police officer. So it's interesting, though, because she also was a police officer, right? So the dynamics even then, and I know it's not fun to talk about gender dynamics or patriarchy, but it's very interesting, well, when both of them are a part of this thin blue line, but who is going to be protected at the end of the day?
Oh, we see that in the military, too, right?
Absolutely. I think that's a great example. In the military, we have tons of issues, right? You're supposed to be a part of this brotherhood, if you will, you know, this group, and yet there's so many women who are becoming not only victims of domestic violence, but also victims of rape.
Right.
What are the issues that you think are often overlooked and neglected in this political season, Kat?
all of them. Honestly, it's entirely about personality at this point. It's entirely about tribalism. If you're team red, team blue, people are ignoring, there's no shared facts, right? No one cares about the policies that people propose, nothing like that. It's disturbing, it's concerning to me.
And what are some of the policies?
Oh, well, I mean, police misconduct is a huge one. Immigration, the economy. I think there's just a wide swath of issues. Trade, the fact that, you know, with our COVID-19 policies that are going on right now in the United States and around the world, U.S. citizens are increasingly not being able to move to places, or by move, I don't mean like move your house, but I mean just like go places outside of the United States. And that's concerning to me. And I'm worried about the precedents that could set as well.
So let me come back to you. I want to challenge you a little here. You know, so I had a conversation with some law enforcement officers as I was preparing for today's show. And so I asked them to give me a different perspective. They tell me about these situations where they go to these scenes. Sometimes they call because of domestic violence, because the woman is being abused. There's a case in the news right now where this guy is, you know, I'm talking about, who's being made a hero. There is alleged that he raped this 14-year-old, did the smell test, and said, I can tell you've been with another man. And they were called to the scene. The law enforcement officers gives these guys every opportunity. They don't want to shoot them. They know what the narrative is. They don't want to get into a confrontation. But they feel emboldened now because of what they see with the movements and the protests. And so law enforcement officers are in the microscope. And so what they tell you is what they don't see, what you don't see before the actual crime or what seems to escalate gets out of control. How do you balance off if you walk in the shoes of law enforcement? I mean, there are some bad actors out there. That's just a fact. And everybody that sometimes gets shot, or sometimes are roughed up, they're not as innocent as you think they are. Now, Breonna Taylor, without a doubt, she should not have died, no doubt at all. George Floyd, he should not have died. But how do you balance it off with the new mentality of people who feel now, and then you lock people up for these felonies, and then you let them out of jail, and they don't have to post bond? What is law enforcement to do now?
Well, I think we have to look at the broader conversation around defunding the police and what activists are asking for, right? Because police don't prevent crime. Police are there to approach a situation once these crimes have already happened. So I think it's really important. And I think it's also important to recognize that police are not trained to handle domestic violence issues. Police are not trained to handle mental issues, right? So I think what's interesting is if we are going to keep police, we should allow them to do policing, not mental health work, not domestic violence work, not all of the various things that they are realistically not trained to do. And I also think it's interesting when we talk about reallocating resources. So again, with policing in the U.S., it's a very reactionary response.
Right.
But I think what's important is to be proactive. So why is this crime happening? Why are people stealing? Why are these things happening? Which is when we talk about, you know, city budgets, you know, so much of the money is being allocated to the reactionary response as opposed to reinvesting in communities so that less crimes are actually taking place. So people have adequate housing, people have food and they don't need to steal. People are getting the counseling services, the psychological services they need for maybe trauma that they've witnessed from generation over generation. I think it's really important that we invest back in the communities. And when we do that, we are not only going to see healthier communities overall, but I think we're going to see less negative police interactions.
But you know what's interesting, Kat, is that a lot of these kids, we respect and support the protesters. I think that's very important. But a lot of these kids that are looting, rioting, and burning, they're white kids.
They're also not protesters a lot of times. A lot of people come because it's fun for them. It's a fun activity. It lets them come do this. It's very different from coming out because you care about the cause, right?
Right.
And I think it's a very selfish motivation. It takes away from the cause. And I think that it's dangerous to collude the two and to view them as the same thing.
You were about to comment on what Brittany was saying.
I was, because I think she's making a very good point here. For instance, when people say things like defund the police, they're not saying that's it, that's all we're going to do, right? They're talking about the fact that police are being asked and tasked with all sorts of things they are not trained to do, and that is part of the reason that we're seeing these repeated negative interactions, right? Like, we need to have a situation where these problems are prevented ahead of time. When people think of police, when they think about what police do, they're thinking about things like solving rapes and murders. We have untested rape kits years going back that are just not being tested. No one's doing anything about them. We have all of these cold murder case files because police are not able to concentrate on those things. They're working on these little things in the streets that we could easily have community leaders helping work with. We could be working to help prevent these. When we're looking at, for instance, like teenagers, a lot of them, they're acting out because they don't have a situation where they're able to express themselves in another way. They don't have other fun things to do. That's the kind of stuff that we could be doing to help prevent this and keeping the police out of those situations, except for when we have things like murder and rape, and letting them actually pursue and end those crimes.
You know, I think all perspectives are so important, and I certainly have not really thought deeply about what you both said about, it's like teachers. They wear too many hats in the classroom, and they can't do their jobs. They never have time to teach. It's the same scenario. I can't thank you for joining us. I hope you'll come back.
I would love to.
Brittany, I hope you come back, and thank you so much for joining us.